Today I've got my brother with me and we're looking to build a cat house for his two cats, George and Jasper. He's brought with him a selection of questionable materials like some small sheets of MDF, some veneered chipboard and some non-veneered chipboard. We've done some drawings to figure out how we can make the most efficient use of the materials that we've got. And the first thing that we need to do is to create the front and the back panels, and we're going to use the 18mm thick chipboard for that.
I started by cutting the piece of chipboard in half with my circular saw, using a straight edge to guide the cut.
We've got both pieces cut square to one another now, and we're going to add a slight taper to the house just to make it look a little more interesting. We'll have to worry about that in a bit.
I marked up the tapers on each side by measuring in 5cm from the sides at the top and then drawing a straight line from those marks to the bottom corners.
3, 6, 6.
Then we marked up a halfway point, which is where the step would be, and marked up another taper to the top, this time measuring in 2.5cm rather than 5cm, because this taper was half of the distance of the first, if that makes sense. With the two pieces together and the edges flush, I used the circular saw to make most of the cuts. And the jigsaw to finish off the cuts where the circular saw blade wouldn't quite reach.
So now we've got two identical panels for the front and for the back. We're going to use this veneered chipboard to make the longest side panel for the house. And we'll need to cut the ends to match the angle that we cut onto the front and back panels, which is this.
I used the bevel gauge to measure the angle of the tapers, set my table saw blade to that angle, and made the cuts to the ends of the side panels at the appropriate sizes. Then I could check that the side panels were the right size by offering them up to the front and back panels.
Start assembling. So this is the front panel, this is the back panel, and this is one of the side panels. And now I'm going to measure up for the central shelf. 61.
I marked up the portion of the shelf that would fit on the inside of the box and cut this out on the bandsaw. And with all the pieces cut to size, we could then assemble the house using glue and brad nails.
The next piece to add is this MDF shelf, which will be supported on this side by these panels, but we need to add some cleats to the inside of the box to support the other side of the shelf.
With the MDF shelf dry fitted, I made a pencil mark on the inside.
So now I can position the cleats level with the reference line that I've made, and I'm going to pre-drill these because I don't want to split the wood. Because only an idiot would do that.
Then I could glue and nail that in place. And then I could add the final piece to the side.
For the tallest side panel, we want to mount some kind of scratching device. So we've got some of this sisal rope or sisal rope, which is like a natural fibre rope, and we want that to be removable so that we can replace the sisal rope at a later date when needed. So we've got a piece of ply here and we're going to wrap the sisal rope around.
Alan used hot glue to secure the rope to the board.
I've got a piece of spruce here and I'm going to resaw this into thin strips to use as cladding for the front. I'm going to use this piece of drop leaf table as a template to make the arc. Here.
For the top section, Alan wanted a circular window, so that was marked up using a compass and cut out with a jigsaw. Then we added the cladding with glue and brad nails, and it was at this point that we realised that it would have made much more sense to cut the holes out after the cladding had been added, rather than before. But instead we just made a few cuts on the bandsaw to shape the cladding to fit nicely around the holes instead.
Alan's just added a piece of an old fir throw.
New.
Alan's just added a piece of new fir. Alan's just added a piece of fir to the step. Alan's just added a piece of fir to the step using some spray glue, and I've cut up this next piece of cladding to fit around it. But it doesn't. I've glued the wrong side. Now we need to trim off the ends, and we need to be careful here because we don't want to chip the veneer on the plywood. So we've measured very carefully and hopefully this goes well. Alright.
I used my block plane to cut the end grain of the cladding close to being flush with the sides, and I could make it perfectly flush later on with sanding. Then we cut another entrance hole for the top section. This is the very top panel, and Alan is applying spray glue for the fur fabric. We had to leave the glue a few minutes to go tacky before we could apply the fabric.
So how long do we have to wait for it to go tacky?
2 to 3 minutes.
The fabric could then be stapled in place on the bottom of the panel, and then we attached the top panel to the house with brad nails. The following day I sanded the whole thing with the random orbit sander. I did a bit of hand sanding too to break any hard edges around the entrance holes.
I've got some offcuts of sapele left over from the recent treasure chest build, and I'm going to use this to make some trim. First of all, I'm going to make a doorstep for this entrance to hide the chipboard edges.
I rounded over the sapele edges on the belt sander.
Next I need to cut a panel for the bottom, and the only piece left that my brother brought round is this piece of 8mm MDF, and it's really warped and it's very bendy. I could probably use it, but I'd need to reinforce it with some pine slats or something like that. So I'm not going to bother using that, and I found this instead, which is a piece of melamine. It's about 8mm thick, and this came from the back of an old kitchen unit.
The bottom panel was cut to size at the table saw and attached with screws.
Because we're a bit worried about how well the glue will stick to this fur, I'm going to add a trim to this too, and that will hold it in place. These pieces are really thin, so I'm not going to bother mitering the corners. I'm adding a trim to the bottom too, and I'm doing the side panels first because of this angle. So once the side pieces are in place, I can then offer up the front piece and mark up the angle and then cut that on the bandsaw.
I had 4 of these rubber feet laying around, so I attached those to the bottom with screws. And to hide the rest of the chipboard edges, I just painted on some cheap black gloss paint using an artist's brush. And masking tape helped to keep the edges clean. Then I applied some antique pine brie wax to the whole box, including the sapele.
I've got the scratching board clamped in position now, and I can drive in screws from the inside to attach it. I've got an offcut of the pieces of cladding here, and I've sanded one face of that, and I'm going to use this to make a sign saying George and Jasper. I found this in a charity shop recently, and it's new in the box. It's a wood burning iron, and from what I can work out, it's basically a soldering iron but with various shaped different tips, so that you can use these to burn in different shapes into the wood.
I used a simple ball-ended tip, and I came back to make the lettering more bold and add some serifs. Then I could trim off the excess on the bandsaw and gave it a sanding, also rounding over the edges. I stuck this onto a couple of pieces of sapele to create a border. Then I used brad nails to attach it to the front. And then I applied some clear brie wax to the sign.
I just noticed that the fur fabric isn't particularly well glued down at the edge here. So I've cut another piece of sapele at an angle on the table saw, and I'll use this to trim that edge, and that way it's secured on each side.
And finally I added my maker's mark to the back.
This one was quite a fun build, and the most important thing is that George and Jasper seem to both love their new home. The project took around 7 or 8 hours in total, and other than the cost of the sisal rope and the fir throw that we used to clad the top shelf and the step, it didn't cost anything to make because these were just scraps of wood that my brother found in his shed. This thing is quite heavy and it's really solid too, so this thing should last for years and years, which is more than can be said for a lot of the pet products that you can buy in shops. And just before I go, I want to say a massive thank you to anyone who's become a patron over on my Patreon page, which I opened a week or 2 ago. I'm really grateful for the support, and it really does help to keep this channel going. So thanks again very much.